The morning I found my cancer survivor wife crying in her healing garden, holding a $5,000 fine notice for unsightly vegetation that violates community standards, I knew someone had just made the biggest mistake of their suburban life. They thought they were targeting some ugly weeds. They had no idea they'd just declared war on a physician whose wife beat stage 3 breast cancer with the help of those exact medicinal plants. Picture this: 7:30 a.m. Perfect North Carolina, morning by Lake Harmony, and I'm standing in what used to be Elena's sanctuary, watching tears fall onto soil that had literally helped save her life. The smell of chamomile mixed with morning dew, and the sound of my wife's broken heart as she read the violation notice that threatened to destroy everything that had sustained her through 18 months of hell. What would you do if someone fined your cancer survivor spouse for growing the plants that helped her beat a disease that kills 600,000 Americans every year? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I guarantee some of you have dealt with HOA bullies who think their authority trumps medical necessity. Let me back up and tell you how a respected physician and his cancer warrior wife ended up fighting suburban terrorists, because this story starts with the worst news any family can receive and ends with the most satisfying justice you'll ever witness. My name is Dr. Michael Rodriguez, and 2 years before this garden incident, I was sitting in my own oncology office delivering the kind of news that makes time stop and the world collapse. Elena, my wife of 22 years, had stage 3 invasive ductal carcinoma that had spread to her lymph nodes and required immediate aggressive treatment. Elena Maria Santos Rodriguez wasn't just my wife, she was my best friend, my anchor, and the strongest person I'd ever met. At 44, she managed our family practice's nursing staff while raising our twin daughters, Sophia and Carmen, with the kind of grace that made everyone around her feel loved and protected. She spoke 3 languages fluently, made empanadas that could convert vegetarians, and had never met a challenge she couldn't overcome through sheer determination and stubborn optimism. But cancer is different. Cancer doesn't care about your strength, your family, or your dreams. It just takes and takes until there's nothing left to steal. The chemotherapy hit Elena like a biological weapon designed to destroy everything good about being human. The nausea was relentless, the fatigue was crushing, and the mouth sores made eating torture. She lost her beautiful black hair in chunks, her appetite disappeared completely, and some days she was too weak to walk from our bedroom to the kitchen. As her physician husband, I knew the statistics, the protocols, and the brutal mathematics of oncology. But as her partner, I was helpless to watch the woman I loved disappear one treatment at a time, while I maintained professional composure for patients who trusted me to heal what couldn't always be healed. That's when Elena discovered integrative medicine and the healing power of plants that had sustained human health for thousands of years before pharmaceutical companies monetized wellness. During her research between chemo sessions, she learned about medicinal herbs that could alleviate treatment side effects, boost immune function, and provide nutritional support that traditional medicine often overlooked. Turmeric for inflammation, ginger for nausea, milk thistle for liver protection during chemotherapy, echinacea for immune support, holy basil for stress reduction. Elena began growing these plants in our backyard, creating a medicinal garden that became her refuge from the clinical sterility of cancer treatment. The transformation was remarkable. Elena's nausea decreased significantly when she used fresh ginger root instead of pharmaceutical antiemetics. Her energy levels improved with turmeric tea that both reduced the chronic inflammation caused by chemotherapy. The holy basil helped her sleep without prescription medications that left her groggy and disconnected. More importantly, the garden gave Elena purpose and hope during the darkest period of our lives. Every morning, she'd spend time tending her plants, harvesting what she needed, and connecting with the natural world that was helping heal her body. The garden became a symbol of her refusal to surrender to cancer, proof that she was actively fighting for her life rather than passively accepting treatment. After 18 months of conventional treatment, supported by Elena's medicinal plants, her oncologist delivered news that still makes me emotional: complete remission, no detectable cancer cells, clean scans. Elena had beaten stage 3 breast cancer through a combination of aggressive medical treatment and the integrative healing approaches that her garden had made possible. We moved to Willowbrook Shores, a beautiful lakeside community in North Carolina, 6 months after Elena's last chemotherapy session. The house came with a perfect backyard for expanding Elena's medicinal garden, and the peaceful lake setting seemed ideal for her continued recovery and our family's fresh start after surviving cancer's attempt to destroy everything we loved. Elena transplanted her medicinal plants with the care of someone moving precious family heirlooms. Each herb represented a victory over cancer, a tool in her survival arsenal, and a living reminder of her strength during the fight for her life. The garden wasn't just landscaping, it was Elena's insurance policy against cancer's return, and her daily affirmation that she'd chosen life over surrender. The first year in Willowbrook Shores was everything we'd hoped for. Elena's garden thrived in the North Carolina climate. Our daughters adjusted beautifully to their new schools, and I established a successful family practice that served our lakeside community. Elena's health remained excellent, her energy returned to pre-cancer levels, and she began volunteering with local cancer support groups, sharing her integrative healing knowledge with other survivors. The neighbors were wonderful people who understood Elena's journey and celebrated her survival. Margaret Walsh, a retired teacher whose husband had died from colon cancer, often visited Elena's garden to learn about medicinal plants that might have helped her late spouse. Frank Morrison, a veteran dealing with PTSD, found peace working alongside Elena as she taught him about holy basil and chamomile for anxiety management. Elena's garden became an informal community resource where neighbors learned about natural healing, shared their own health struggles, and found hope in the story of someone who'd beaten cancer through determination and plant medicine. The garden represented everything beautiful about human resilience and community support. I should have known that peace wouldn't last. It never does when entitled people mistake temporary authority for the right to control other people's medical decisions. Enter Margaret Thornfield, 62 years old, HOA Architectural Review Committee Chairwoman for 3 consecutive terms, and the kind of woman who treats homeowner covenants like sacred scripture that must be enforced with religious zealotry. Picture someone who considers plant identification a qualification for medical expertise and measures her self-worth by the number of violation notices she issues monthly. Margaret had moved to Willowbrook Shores 2 years earlier from a gated community in Charlotte, bringing with her an arsenal of HOA horror stories and an obsession with property values that bordered on pathological. She'd systematically transformed our peaceful community into a surveillance state where residents lived in fear of citation and neighbors reported each other for infractions that existed only in Margaret's twisted interpretation of aesthetic standards. Margaret's first encounter with Elena's medicinal garden happened during her monthly property inspection tour, where she documented potential violations with the dedication of a crime scene investigator and the empathy of a parking meter. Elena was harvesting turmeric root when this woman appeared in our backyard, like some suburban vampire, clipboard clutched against her chest, an iPhone already recording. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she announced without invitation or introduction, "this garden appears to violate our landscaping guidelines regarding appropriate plant species and aesthetic compatibility with community standards. I'll need documentation proving these plants are approved varieties before I can authorize their continued presence." Elena looked up from her turmeric harvest, soil under her fingernails and sunshine in her hair, radiating the kind of health that comes from beating cancer and choosing life every single day. "Ma'am, these are medicinal herbs that help save my life during cancer treatment. They're not just plants, they're part of my ongoing health maintenance and recovery protocol." Margaret's smile was colder than a chemotherapy infusion room. "Personal medical circumstances don't override community standards, Mrs. Rodriguez. Willowbrook Shores maintains strict guidelines about appropriate landscaping, and these plants create visual inconsistency that affects property values. I'll expect compliance documentation by Friday, or you'll receive formal violation notices." That evening, Elena told me about the encounter while we prepared dinner using herbs from her garden. Her voice carried the kind of quiet strength that had sustained her through cancer, but I could hear the concern underneath her calm exterior. "Michael," she said, chopping fresh basil that had helped reduce her treatment nausea, "I think we might have a problem with the HOA. That woman acted like my garden was some kind of neighborhood eyesore instead of the thing that helped save my life." I wrapped my arms around my wife, breathing in the scent of her healthy hair, and feeling grateful for every day cancer hadn't stolen from us. "Don't worry about Margaret Thornfield," I said. "She's just another suburban bully who thinks her clipboard gives her authority over other people's medical decisions. We'll handle whatever comes next." What came next was a systematic campaign of harassment that would have impressed totalitarian dictators with its thoroughness and cruelty. Margaret began documenting Elena's garden with surveillance-level obsession, photographing individual plants, measuring their heights, and researching their scientific names like she was building a botanical war crimes case. The first violation notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the kind of official ceremony usually reserved for court summons. Elena found it taped to our front door, a formal document that transformed her healing sanctuary into a legal liability and her cancer-fighting plants into community violations. Notice of landscape covenant violation. The document proclaimed in bold letters that made my medical training irrelevant and Elena's survival story meaningless. Unauthorized vegetation installation creates aesthetic disruption and violates Article 7, Section 3 of Willowbrook Shores, homeowner covenants regarding appropriate plant species and landscape compatibility. The violation demanded immediate removal of all non-approved vegetation within 14 days, or face escalating fines starting at $500 daily. The notice was signed by Margaret Thornfield, with the flourish of someone who believed she was protecting civilization from the dangerous threat of medicinal plants. Elena read the violation notice twice, her hands trembling slightly with the kind of controlled emotion that reminded me of her quiet strength during chemotherapy. "Michael," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, "they want me to destroy the garden that helped save my life because it doesn't match their idea of appropriate landscaping." I took the violation notice from Elena's hands, reading Margaret's bureaucratic language that reduced my wife's survival story to aesthetic non-compliance and her medicinal plants to unauthorized vegetation. The physician in me was furious at the medical ignorance, but the husband in me was calculating exactly how to destroy someone who'd made my cancer survivor wife cry. "Elena," I said, my voice carrying 20 years of medical training and 22 years of loving this remarkable woman, "no one is destroying your garden. These plants help save your life, and anyone who tries to take them away is going to learn exactly what happens when civilians threaten a physician's patient care." The next morning, I called Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a colleague who specialized in integrative oncology and had published extensively on medicinal plants in cancer treatment. Jennifer had consulted on Elena's case during her chemotherapy, helping develop the herbal protocols that had supported her recovery while working alongside conventional treatment. "Michael," she said after I explained our HOA situation, "what you're describing isn't just harassment, it's potential violation of disability accommodation laws. Elena's medicinal garden isn't landscaping, it's ongoing medical treatment for a chronic condition. Federal law protects cancer survivors' right to maintain necessary health accommodations." Jennifer connected me with Robert Chen, a civil rights attorney who specialized in disability discrimination and had handled dozens of cases involving HOA harassment of residents with medical conditions. Robert's track record included successful federal lawsuits against communities that had violated disabled residents' rights through selective enforcement and discriminatory policies. "Dr. Rodriguez," Robert explained during our consultation, "your wife's situation falls under multiple federal protections. The Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities, including cancer survivors who require ongoing medical accommodations. The Americans with Disabilities Act provides additional protections for necessary health-related modifications to living environments." Robert's analysis revealed that Margaret's violation notice wasn't just HOA overreach. It was potential federal civil rights violation that could result in substantial legal consequences for both Margaret personally and Willowbrook Shores as a community. Elena's medicinal garden qualified as reasonable accommodation for her disability, and any attempt to force its removal constituted discrimination based on medical condition. But the legal protections were just the beginning. Robert explained that federal disability law included provisions for damages, attorney fees, and injunctive relief that could transform Margaret's harassment campaign into a very expensive lesson about respecting disabled residents' rights. Armed with legal knowledge and growing righteous fury, I decided to give Margaret one opportunity to retreat before I introduced her to the federal court system. I requested a meeting with the HOA board to discuss Elena's garden and explain the medical necessity that made it protected accommodation rather than landscaping violation. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center, where Margaret held court like some suburban Supreme Court justice dispensing wisdom to lesser homeowners who dared question her authority. I arrived with medical documentation, legal research, and the kind of professional confidence that comes from knowing you're absolutely right while your opponent is catastrophically wrong. Margaret presided over the meeting with the arrogance of someone who'd never faced serious opposition to her interpretation of HOA authority. She'd invited the entire board, apparently expecting public humiliation, would force compliance with her demands to destroy Elena's medicinal garden. "Dr. Rodriguez," she began, consulting her clipboard like it contained constitutional amendments, "your wife's unauthorized vegetation creates aesthetic disruption that affects property values throughout our community. Personal circumstances don't override our responsibility to maintain appropriate landscaping standards that protect everyone's investment." I stood up slowly, the way I did when delivering serious medical news to families who needed to understand the gravity of their situation. "Margaret," I said, my voice carrying 2 decades of professional authority, "my wife's garden isn't unauthorized vegetation. It's ongoing medical treatment for a cancer survivor who requires continued health accommodations to maintain her remission status." Margaret's confident expression flickered like a television with bad reception, but her suburban dictator programming ran too deep to acknowledge error easily. "Dr. Rodriguez, medical treatments don't exempt residents from community standards. We maintain aesthetic guidelines that apply equally to all homeowners, regardless of personal health circumstances." I opened my folder and began reading from the federal statutes that were about to transform Margaret's harassment into criminal liability. The Fair Housing Act, Section 3604, prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities, including cancer survivors who require reasonable accommodations for ongoing health maintenance. The Americans with Disabilities Act provides additional protections for necessary medical modifications to living environments. The other board members shifted uncomfortably as federal law invaded their comfortable world of landscaping violations and aesthetic standards. But Margaret doubled down with the desperation of someone whose entire worldview depended on her authority being absolute and unchallenged. "Federal laws don't override private community covenants," she insisted, apparently believing her clipboard authority superseded constitutional protections. "Homeowner associations maintain the right to enforce standards that protect property values, regardless of individual circumstances." I smiled with the kind of professional patience I developed while explaining complex medical concepts to people who preferred ignorance to understanding. "Margaret, federal disability law specifically prohibits exactly what you're attempting to do. Elena's medicinal garden is protected accommodation for her cancer survivor status. Any attempt to force its removal constitutes disability discrimination that carries substantial legal penalties." The room fell silent as Margaret realized she was no longer dealing with a homeowner she could intimidate, but a physician who understood both medicine and law well enough to destroy her harassment campaign. The other board members looked like they were witnessing a car accident in slow motion, recognizing disaster but unable to prevent the inevitable collision. Margaret's final mistake was escalating instead of retreating. "Dr. Rodriguez," she said, her voice rising with the kind of desperate authority that reveals underlying weakness, "the HOA board will proceed with violation enforcement regardless of your legal theories. Community standards must be maintained, and your wife's garden violates multiple covenant restrictions." "Margaret," I replied, my voice quiet enough to make everyone lean forward to hear the words that would end her harassment campaign forever. "You just committed federal disability discrimination in front of witnesses while rejecting legally protected accommodations for a cancer survivor. I want to thank you for making the civil rights lawsuit so much easier to win." The federal complaint was filed within 72 hours, naming both Margaret personally and Willowbrook Shores HOA as defendants in a disability discrimination case that included violations of fair housing laws, civil rights statutes, and reasonable accommodation requirements. Robert Chen had crafted a lawsuit that was both legally devastating and personally satisfying, seeking damages, attorney fees, and injunctive relief that would protect Elena's garden permanently. The complaint detailed Margaret's systematic harassment of a cancer survivor, her rejection of federally protected medical accommodations, and her escalation of discriminatory enforcement despite being informed of applicable legal protections. Each violation notice, each threatening communication, and each refusal to accept Elena's garden as necessary medical accommodation became evidence of intentional discrimination against a disabled resident. But the lawsuit was just the beginning of Margaret's education about federal disability law and the consequences of targeting cancer survivors. The Department of Housing and Urban Development opened a parallel investigation into Willowbrook Shore's compliance with fair housing laws, examining whether Margaret's harassment was part of a broader pattern of discrimination against disabled residents. The HUD investigation revealed systematic problems with how Willowbrook Shores handled accommodation requests from disabled residents. Margaret had denied reasonable modifications for wheelchair ramps, rejected service animal registrations, and consistently interpreted HOA covenants in ways that discriminated against people with medical conditions. The scope of Margaret's discrimination was staggering. She'd targeted elderly residents with mobility issues, families with autistic children, and veterans with PTSD, using selective enforcement of HOA rules to harass anyone whose disability required accommodations that didn't match her narrow interpretation of community standards. Federal investigators found documented evidence of Margaret's discriminatory enforcement patterns, including email communications where she discussed strategies for making disabled residents uncomfortable enough to sell their homes and move elsewhere. Her own words became the evidence that would destroy her defense and guarantee substantial federal penalties. The criminal investigation began when federal prosecutors reviewed HUD's findings and determined that Margaret's actions constituted intentional civil rights violations that warranted criminal charges. The FBI's Civil Rights Division opened a case targeting Margaret's systematic harassment of disabled residents, treating her HOA position as a platform for organized discrimination. Special Agent Maria Santos from the FBI's Civil Rights Division interviewed Elena and me about our experiences with Margaret's harassment. Agent Santos was a professional woman who understood both federal disability law and the investigative techniques needed to build criminal civil rights cases. Dr. Rodriguez, she explained during our interview, your wife's case appears to be part of a broader pattern of disability discrimination that rises to the level of criminal civil rights violations. We're investigating Mrs. Thornfield's systematic targeting of disabled residents as potential federal crimes, rather than simple civil disputes. The federal investigation expanded beyond Margaret's individual actions to examine Willowbrook Shore's institutional failures in protecting disabled residents' rights. The HOA board had enabled Margaret's discrimination by refusing to provide oversight, rejecting legitimate accommodation requests, and maintaining policies that systematically disadvantage residents with medical conditions. Agent Santos revealed that federal prosecutors were considering charges under the Civil Rights Act, which criminalized intentional discrimination against protected classes, including disabled individuals. Margaret's documented harassment of cancer survivors, veterans, and elderly residents qualified as organized criminal activity targeting vulnerable populations. The community response to Elena's lawsuit was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors who'd watched Elena's cancer battle and celebrated her recovery were horrified to learn that Margaret had tried to destroy the garden that had helped save her life. The revelation that Margaret had been systematically targeting disabled residents throughout the community sparked outrage that transformed into organized resistance. Margaret Walsh, the retired teacher whose husband had died from cancer, organized a petition supporting Elena's right to maintain her medicinal garden. Within days, over 200 residents had signed the petition, many sharing their own stories of Margaret's discriminatory harassment targeting their disabilities, medical conditions, or family circumstances. Frank Morrison, the veteran who had learned about anxiety management through Elena's garden, started a support group for residents who'd been targeted by Margaret's discrimination. The group included elderly residents with mobility issues, families with autistic children, and other disabled homeowners who'd suffered under Margaret's systematic harassment campaign. The petition and support group activities attracted local media attention, with news outlets covering the story of an HOA official who'd tried to force a cancer survivor to destroy her healing garden. The coverage framed the issue as disability discrimination disguised as landscaping enforcement, with Margaret as the villain targeting vulnerable residents. Elena's story resonated with cancer survivors throughout North Carolina, many of whom contacted us to share similar experiences, with HOA harassment targeting their medical accommodations. The response revealed that Margaret's discrimination wasn't unique, but part of a broader pattern of disability harassment that occurred in communities throughout the state. The media coverage expanded from local news to national attention, as Elena's story captured the intersection of HOA abuse, disability rights, and cancer survivorship. Elena was interviewed by health advocacy organizations, disability rights groups, and cancer support networks that recognized her case as representing broader issues affecting disabled homeowners nationwide. Margaret's response to the growing legal pressure was predictably desperate and self-destructive. Faced with federal civil rights charges and community-wide condemnation of her discrimination, she escalated her harassment campaign in ways that guaranteed more serious criminal charges and longer prison sentences. Margaret began leaving threatening messages on our voicemail, warning that Elena's lawsuit would result in assessments for all homeowners and promising that continuing legal action would make our lives miserable until we withdrew our complaint. Each message violated federal witness intimidation laws while providing additional evidence for prosecutors building their criminal case. The document destruction began when Margaret realized that her email communications and HOA records contained damning evidence of her discriminatory intent and systematic targeting of disabled residents. She broke into the community center at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, attempting to shred financial records and correspondence that federal investigators had already copied during their evidence collection. Security cameras captured Margaret's amateur crime spree, including clear footage of her license plate, facial identification, and the specific documents she attempted to destroy. Each act of obstruction added new federal charges to her growing criminal liability, while demonstrating the consciousness of guilt that prosecutors love to present to juries. Margaret's final mistake was attempting to intimidate other disabled residents who'd cooperated with federal investigators. She sent threatening letters to wheelchair users, families with autistic children, and elderly residents with medical conditions, warning them about the consequences of supporting Elena's lawsuit against community authority. Each intimidation attempt constituted witness tampering, a federal felony that carried automatic prison sentences and enhanced penalties for targeting disabled victims. Margaret had transformed simple disability discrimination into organized criminal activity that guaranteed substantial federal prison time. The federal indictment was unsealed on a crisp October morning that reminded me of Elena's first day of remission, when hope returned after months of darkness. United States versus Margaret Ann Thornfield included 17 federal charges ranging from civil rights violations to witness tampering, with potential sentences totaling over 30 years in federal prison. The charges detailed Margaret's systematic discrimination against disabled residents, her obstruction of federal investigations, and her intimidation of witnesses who'd cooperated with civil rights prosecutors. The indictment read like a manual for how not to treat disabled homeowners, with Margaret's own words providing evidence of her discriminatory intent and criminal consciousness. The criminal trial was scheduled for early spring, but the civil lawsuit provided more immediate relief for Elena and protection for her medicinal garden. Federal Judge Susan Martinez issued a preliminary injunction prohibiting any interference with Elena's garden, while the disability discrimination case proceeded through court. Judge Martinez's injunction was comprehensive and permanent, protecting not just Elena's current medicinal plants, but her right to maintain and expand her healing garden as necessary medical accommodation for her cancer survivor status. The court specifically recognized Elena's garden as protected medical treatment rather than decorative landscaping subject to HOA oversight. The preliminary injunction also included broader protections for disabled residents throughout Willowbrook Shores, requiring the HOA to implement accommodation procedures that complied with federal disability laws. Margaret's discrimination had resulted in court-ordered reforms that protected every disabled resident in the community. But the most satisfying aspect of the injunction was the financial impact on Margaret personally. Judge Martinez ruled that Margaret's discriminatory enforcement had caused substantial emotional distress to Elena, awarding damages that included medical expenses, therapy costs, and punitive damages designed to deter future discrimination against disabled residents. The monetary award was followed by attorney fee provisions that made Margaret personally liable for the costs of Elena's legal representation. Federal disability law includes fee-shifting provisions that require discriminating parties to pay for their victims' legal expenses, transforming Margaret's harassment into an expensive lesson about respecting disabled residents' rights. The criminal trial opened 6 months after Elena's garden had been saved by federal court order. Margaret faced 17 felony charges in a federal courtroom, where disability discrimination wasn't treated as community standards enforcement, but as serious civil rights violations deserving substantial punishment. The prosecution team was led by Assistant United States Attorney Jennifer Walsh, a former disability rights advocate who understood both federal civil rights law and the devastating impact of housing discrimination on vulnerable populations. Walsh had built her career destroying people who targeted disabled individuals, and Margaret's case provided overwhelming evidence of systematic criminal activity. The trial evidence included recordings of Margaret's discriminatory statements, email communications documenting her targeting of disabled residents, and witness testimony from dozens of disabled homeowners who'd suffered under her harassment campaigns. Elena's testimony was particularly powerful, describing how Margaret's discrimination had threatened her ongoing cancer recovery and psychological well-being. Elena took the witness stand wearing a blue dress that complemented her healthy complexion and hair that had grown back thicker and more beautiful than before chemotherapy. She spoke with quiet dignity about her cancer battle, the role of medicinal plants in her recovery, and the emotional devastation of being targeted for maintaining the garden that had helped save her life. The jury listened with obvious sympathy as Elena described Margaret's systematic harassment, from the first violation notice through the escalation of threats and intimidation. Her testimony transformed Margaret's actions from bureaucratic enforcement into personal cruelty, targeting someone whose only crime was surviving cancer and maintaining her health. The defense strategy was pathetic in its desperation and insulting in its assumptions about federal disability law. Margaret's attorney, an expensive criminal defense lawyer from Charlotte, attempted to portray her discrimination as good faith enforcement of community standards by a dedicated volunteer protecting property values. The defense argument collapsed when prosecutors presented recordings where Margaret specifically targeted disabled residents, discussed strategies for making their lives difficult, and bragged about her ability to force disabled homeowners to sell their properties and leave the community. Her own words destroyed any possibility of claiming innocent mistakes or legitimate community enforcement. Margaret's testimony in her own defense was a masterpiece of self-destruction that sealed her fate while revealing the depth of her discriminatory intent. She spent 2 days on the witness stand, attempting to justify her harassment, while demonstrating the prejudice and malice underlying her systematic targeting of disabled residents. When Prosecutor Walsh asked Margaret to explain why she'd targeted Elena's medicinal garden specifically, her response revealed the discriminatory animus that had motivated her harassment campaign. Cancer survivors need to understand that private communities maintain standards that can't be compromised for individual medical circumstances, she said, displaying exactly the kind of disability discrimination that federal law prohibits. The jury deliberation lasted less than 3 hours, barely enough time to review the evidence and complete paperwork for guilty verdicts on all 17 federal charges. The foreman, a retired nurse who understood both medical necessity and disability rights, delivered the verdicts with professional authority while staring directly at Margaret throughout the reading. Judge Martinez scheduled sentencing for 8 weeks after conviction, allowing time for pre-sentence investigation and victim impact statements from the dozens of disabled residents who'd suffered under Margaret's discriminatory harassment. The Federal Probation Office recommended 15 years in prison, full restitution to all victims, and lifetime supervision following release from federal custody. The victim impact statements provided opportunity for Margaret's disabled victims to address the court directly about the harm caused by her systematic discrimination. Elena chose to speak for all cancer survivors who'd faced housing discrimination, representing not just her own experience, but the broader issue of protecting disabled residents' rights. Your Honor, Elena began, her voice carrying the strength that had sustained her through cancer, and the grace that had helped her forgive people who'd tried to destroy her healing. I survived stage 3 breast cancer through medical treatment, supported by the medicinal plants Mrs. Thornfield tried to force me to destroy. Her discrimination wasn't just about landscaping rules, it was about attacking my right to maintain the health accommodations that help prevent cancer recurrence. Margaret sat at the defendant's table in orange prison clothing, her suburban authority replaced by federal custody, and her discrimination exposed as criminal behavior. The woman who'd tried to destroy Elena's healing garden was learning that federal disability law provides real protection for cancer survivors and serious consequences for people who target them. Elena continued her statement, addressing both the court and the broader issue of disability discrimination that Margaret's case had exposed. Cancer survivors and other disabled individuals deserve communities where our medical needs are respected rather than punished. Mrs. Thornfield's systematic harassment of disabled residents demonstrates why federal civil rights laws exist and why enforcement of those laws must include substantial consequences for discrimination. Judge Martinez sentenced Margaret to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, with full restitution of over $400,000 to disabled residents she'd targeted throughout her discrimination campaign. The sentence included forfeiture of assets derived from her criminal enterprise and lifetime prohibition from serving in any HOA leadership position. The most satisfying aspect of Margaret's sentence was the community service requirement following her prison release. Judge Martinez specifically ordered Margaret to work at disability advocacy organizations and cancer support centers, ensuring she'd spend years serving the disabled communities she'd targeted during her criminal career. The conviction and sentencing made national news as disability discrimination, disguised as HOA enforcement, escalated into major federal criminal prosecution. Margaret Thornfield became a cautionary tale about housing discrimination, civil rights violations, and the federal consequences of targeting disabled residents through systematic harassment. The broader impacts extended far beyond individual justice for Margaret's victims. The case established federal precedent for prosecuting HOA discrimination as serious civil rights violations, leading to similar investigations nationwide, where disabled residents face systematic harassment disguised as community standards enforcement. The Department of Housing and Urban Development created new enforcement protocols for investigating disability discrimination in homeowner associations, while Congress held hearings on HOA reform legislation designed to prevent similar targeting of disabled residents. Margaret's case became the foundation for strengthened federal protections for disabled homeowners nationwide. Willowbrook Shores underwent complete transformation following Margaret's federal conviction. The new HOA board, elected after community-wide recognition of systematic disability discrimination, implemented accommodation procedures that exceeded federal requirements while ensuring disabled residents receive support rather than harassment. The community culture changed dramatically as neighbors who'd been isolated by Margaret's discrimination began working together to create an inclusive environment where disabled residents felt valued rather than targeted. Annual disability awareness events replaced Margaret's harassment campaigns, while Elena's garden became symbol of community acceptance and medical accommodation rights. Most importantly, Elena's medicinal garden thrives in the North Carolina climate, providing ongoing health support for her cancer survivorship, while serving as educational resource for other disabled residents learning about natural healing approaches. The garden represents victory over both cancer and discrimination, proof that federal disability law provides real protection when enforced through determined advocacy. Elena's health remains excellent 5 years after beating cancer, with regular oncology checkups confirming continued remission and optimal wellness markers. Her medicinal garden continues providing nutritional and therapeutic support that complements conventional medical care, demonstrating the value of integrative approaches to cancer survivorship and ongoing health maintenance. The healing garden has become a community gathering place where neighbors learn about medicinal plants, disabled residents share accommodation strategies, and visitors find inspiration in Elena's story of surviving cancer while fighting discrimination. The garden proves that federal disability law can transform communities when disabled residents refuse to accept harassment as acceptable community standards. Elena's advocacy work expanded beyond our community to include statewide cancer survivor support and disability rights education. She speaks regularly at medical conferences about integrative oncology, testifies before legislative committees about disability discrimination, and mentors other cancer survivors facing housing harassment based on their medical accommodation needs. Our daughters, Sophia and Carmen, learned powerful lessons about standing up for disabled family members and using legal protections to fight systematic discrimination. Both girls volunteer with disability advocacy organizations while pursuing medical careers inspired by Elena's integration of conventional treatment with natural healing approaches that helped save her life. The federal legislation inspired by Elena's case, known as the Disabled Homeowner Protection Act, strengthened accommodation requirements for homeowner associations while increasing penalties for systematic disability discrimination. The legislation provides enhanced protections for cancer survivors, veterans with PTSD, and other disabled residents who require medical accommodations that might conflict with traditional community standards. Margaret Thornfield began serving her federal prison sentence at a minimum security facility designed for white-collar criminals, where clipboard authority provides no protection from the consequences of targeting disabled residents. Her conviction serves as permanent reminder that disability discrimination carries serious federal penalties regardless of suburban setting or community position. The ripple effects continue expanding as similar cases across America follow Elena's precedent for federal prosecution of HOA discrimination against disabled residents. Every successful prosecution makes future harassment less likely, while demonstrating that federal disability law provides meaningful protection for cancer survivors and other disabled homeowners facing systematic targeting. 3 years after Margaret's federal conviction, Elena received a letter from a cancer survivor in Colorado whose HOA was trying to force removal of her medicinal garden through similar discrimination tactics. Elena connected her with disability rights attorneys and federal investigators, leading to another successful prosecution that resulted in criminal charges and substantial damages for the targeted cancer survivor. The Colorado case established additional precedent for protecting cancer survivors' medicinal gardens as federally protected medical accommodations, while demonstrating that Elena's victory in North Carolina was an isolated incident, but part of broader pattern of disability discrimination requiring aggressive federal enforcement. Standing in Elena's thriving medicinal garden this morning, watching hummingbirds feed from holy basil flowers while the sun reflects off Lake Harmony, I'm reminded of why we fought so hard against Margaret's discrimination, not just for Elena's right to maintain her healing plants, but for every disabled resident who deserves communities that support rather than harass them for their medical accommodation needs. The garden represents more than Elena's cancer survivorship or our victory over disability discrimination. It symbolizes the principle that federal law provides real protection for disabled residents when communities fail to respect their accommodation rights, and that systematic harassment of vulnerable populations will face serious federal consequences regardless of suburban setting. Elena's story continues inspiring cancer survivors nationwide who face housing discrimination, disability harassment, and community resistance to their medical accommodation needs. Her courage in fighting Margaret's systematic targeting proved that federal disability law can transform communities when disabled residents refuse to accept harassment as normal or inevitable. The morning air carries the scent of chamomile and turmeric, mixed with lake breeze and the sounds of children playing in yards where families understand that community strength comes from supporting rather than targeting disabled neighbors. Elena's garden grows more beautiful each year, providing ongoing testament to the power of natural healing supported by federal legal protection. Most importantly, Elena remains cancer-free, healthy, and committed to helping other disabled residents understand their federal accommodation rights, while building communities where medical diversity is celebrated rather than punished. Her medicinal garden blooms as proof that cancer can be beaten, discrimination can be overcome, and federal disability law provides meaningful protection when enforced with determination and community support. The transformation extends beyond individual healing to institutional change that protects disabled residents throughout North Carolina and beyond. Elena's case demonstrated that housing discrimination against disabled residents constitutes serious federal crime deserving substantial punishment, while establishing legal precedent that continues protecting cancer survivors and other disabled homeowners facing similar harassment. Sometimes the best medicine isn't found in prescription bottles or chemotherapy infusions, but in gardens that heal both bodies and communities while proving that federal law can transform hatred into understanding when disabled residents refuse to surrender their accommodation rights to suburban dictators who mistake temporary authority for permanent power over vulnerable populations. Elena's medicinal garden continues growing, her health remains excellent, and federal disability law provides ongoing protection for cancer survivors facing housing discrimination. Margaret Thornfield learned her lessons from federal prison, but the rest of us learned that disabled residents can overcome systematic harassment when they understand their federal rights and refuse to accept discrimination as acceptable community standards. Standing here surrounded by plants that helped save my wife's life, I'm grateful for federal disability law that protects cancer survivors, community support that transformed discrimination into inclusion, and Elena's courage in fighting harassment that could have cost other disabled residents their accommodation rights. The garden represents victory over both cancer and discrimination, proving that healing happens when communities choose support over harassment, and federal law provides meaningful consequences for systematic targeting of disabled residents. What's your experience with HOA discrimination or disability harassment? Share your story in the comments below. Elena reads every comment, and we respond to families facing similar challenges with resources and legal connections. The ongoing impact of Elena's case continues expanding through legislative changes, legal precedents, and community transformations that protect disabled residents from housing discrimination. Every successful prosecution of HOA harassment sends a clear message that targeting cancer survivors and other disabled individuals will result in serious federal consequences, regardless of suburban setting or community authority. Federal investigators now use Elena's case as training material for recognizing disability discrimination disguised as community standards enforcement. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division includes our story in their educational programs for prosecutors handling housing discrimination cases, while the Department of Housing and Urban Development references Elena's garden as example of reasonable medical accommodation that federal law protects absolutely. The medical community has embraced Elena's story as demonstration of integrative oncology's effectiveness when combined with conventional cancer treatment. Elena speaks regularly at medical conferences about the role of medicinal plants in cancer survivorship, while her garden serves as research site for studies examining natural healing approaches that support conventional medical care. Cancer treatment centers throughout North Carolina now include information about patients' rights to maintain medicinal gardens and other health accommodations that support recovery and ongoing wellness. Elena's case established precedent that helps other cancer survivors understand their federal protections, while encouraging medical professionals to support integrative approaches to cancer care. The ripple effects extend internationally, with cancer advocacy organizations in other countries using Elena's story to promote disabled residents' rights and natural healing approaches that complement conventional treatment. Her garden has become a symbol of cancer survivorship that transcends national boundaries while demonstrating universal principles of medical accommodation and community support. Elena's daughters, Sophia and Carmen, now in medical school, credit their mother's cancer battle and discrimination fight with inspiring their career choices. Both young women volunteer with disability rights organizations while studying integrative medicine approaches that honor both scientific rigor and natural healing traditions that have supported human health for millennia. The scholarship fund established with damages from Margaret's conviction has helped dozens of disabled students pursue higher education in disability law, medical advocacy, and integrative health approaches. The Elena Rodriguez Memorial Scholarship specifically supports cancer survivors and disabled students who demonstrate commitment to protecting accommodation rights and promoting inclusive communities. 5 years after Margaret began her federal prison sentence, Elena received another letter from an unexpected source. This time, the letter came from Margaret herself, written from federal custody, where she'd spent years learning about disability rights, cancer survivorship, and the communities she'd damaged through systematic discrimination and harassment. The letter was different from typical prison correspondence, filled with genuine remorse and understanding of the harm she'd caused Elena and dozens of other disabled residents. Margaret wrote about mandatory disability awareness classes, volunteer work with cancer support groups, and the gradual recognition that her harassment had targeted people whose only crime was requiring medical accommodations to maintain their health and well-being. Margaret's letter described her work with other incarcerated women who'd committed civil rights violations, learning about the human cost of discrimination while developing empathy she'd never possessed during her HOA leadership. She wrote about cancer patients she'd met in prison whose stories helped her understand the courage required to fight disease while facing community harassment for medical accommodation needs. The most significant aspect of Margaret's letter was her request to contribute to Elena's advocacy work following her release from federal prison. She expressed willingness to speak about the consequences of disability discrimination, share her story as cautionary tale for other community leaders, and work toward preventing similar harassment of disabled residents in communities throughout the nation. Elena considered Margaret's letter carefully, discussing with me whether forgiveness and redemption were possible for someone who'd caused such systematic harm to vulnerable populations. After consultation with other disabled residents who'd been targeted by Margaret's discrimination, Elena decided to respond positively to Margaret's apparent transformation and commitment to advocacy work. Elena's response to Margaret was gracious but firm, acknowledging the possibility of redemption while emphasizing the ongoing harm caused by years of systematic harassment targeting disabled residents. She offered to consider collaboration on disability advocacy work following Margaret's release, contingent on demonstrated commitment to protecting rather than harassing disabled community members. The correspondence between Elena and Margaret became part of broader discussions about restorative justice for civil rights violations, rehabilitation possibilities for discriminatory offenders, and community healing following systematic harassment of protected populations. Elena's willingness to consider forgiveness demonstrated the grace that had sustained her through cancer while maintaining accountability for criminal behavior. Standing in Elena's medicinal garden this evening, watching fireflies dance among healing plants, while Lake Harmony reflects the last sunlight of another day in freedom, I'm reminded of the journey that brought us from cancer diagnosis, through discrimination, fight, to federal victory, and ongoing advocacy for disabled residents nationwide. The garden represents more than plants that helped save Elena's life or legal victory that protected her accommodation rights. It symbolizes the principle that communities become stronger when they support disabled residents rather than target them, and that federal law provides meaningful protection when disabled individuals refuse to accept harassment as inevitable or acceptable. Elena's story continues inspiring disabled residents facing housing discrimination, medical professionals learning about integrative approaches to patient care, and community leaders who want to create inclusive environments where accommodation needs are met with support rather than resistance. Her courage in fighting systematic harassment proved that ordinary citizens can achieve extraordinary change when they understand their rights and refuse to surrender their dignity to suburban dictators. The transformation of Willowbrook Shores from discriminatory community to inclusive neighborhood demonstrates that systemic change is possible when disabled residents organize, federal law is enforced effectively, and communities choose support over harassment. Elena's garden grows as living testament to healing that encompasses both individual recovery and community transformation. Most importantly, Elena remains healthy, active, and committed to protecting disabled residents' rights while promoting integrative approaches to health and wellness that honor both medical science and natural healing traditions. Her medicinal garden continues providing therapeutic benefit while serving as educational resource for anyone interested in learning about plants that support human health and federal laws that protect accommodation rights. The federal legislation inspired by Elena's case continues protecting disabled homeowners nationwide, while similar prosecutions demonstrate that housing discrimination will face serious legal consequences, regardless of community setting or leadership position. Margaret Thornfield's federal conviction serves as permanent reminder that targeting disabled residents constitutes criminal behavior, deserving substantial punishment and community condemnation. Elena's legacy extends beyond individual survival to systemic change that protects cancer survivors, disabled veterans, elderly residents, and other vulnerable populations who require accommodation support rather than harassment and discrimination. Her story proves that federal disability law can transform communities when disabled residents understand their rights and demand enforcement of protections that exist specifically to prevent systematic targeting of vulnerable populations. The healing continues, both in Elena's thriving medicinal garden and in communities across America, where disabled residents now understand their federal accommodation rights and refuse to accept discrimination as normal or inevitable. Elena's courage in fighting Margaret's systematic harassment created legal precedent that continues protecting disabled homeowners, while demonstrating that ordinary citizens can achieve extraordinary justice when they refuse to surrender their dignity to suburban tyranny. Federal disability law works when disabled residents understand their rights, communities support accommodation needs, and prosecutors enforce civil rights protections with determination and appropriate consequences for systematic harassment. Elena's story proves that cancer can be survived, discrimination can be defeated, and communities can transform from harassment to healing when disabled residents refuse to accept targeting as acceptable community standard. The medicinal garden blooms more beautifully each year. Elena's health remains excellent, and federal disability law provides ongoing protection for cancer survivors facing housing discrimination. Sometimes the most powerful medicine grows in gardens defended by federal law and tended with love that refuses to surrender to suburban dictators who mistake temporary authority for permanent power over disabled residents who deserve support rather than systematic harassment and discrimination. What's your worst HOA horror story? Drop it in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else going through the same battle. Hit that subscribe button if you love seeing bullies get what they deserve. And ring that notification bell for more HOA Revenge Stories, where justice is served ice cold. Remember, sometimes standing up to neighborhood tyrants doesn't just save yourself, it saves everyone around you. When good people refuse to be intimidated by fake authority, entire communities can break free from fear. Thanks for watching HOA Revenge Stories, where we prove that every HOA Karen eventually meets their match.